Mr. Costanza, or Bishop, whoever would like to go next.
Go ahead.
Thank you and good afternoon, Chairman Fall and committee members, for hearing this important pro-life bill. My name is Tom Costanza, Executive Director of the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops. And the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops have consistently and resolutely provided pro-life pastoral teaching on the sacredness of life from conception to natural death. And to Senator Mizell's point, we remain deeply aware of the pain and grief that victims suffer, especially those who have lost a loved one through the crime of murder or crimes of violence. And we pledge to deepen our commitment to persons who have suffered such violence, anguish, and pain. And our opposition to the death penalty is not intended in any way to diminish what victims and their families have suffered. It is a statement, rather, which affirms the lives of those lost and the ultimate value of life in general. St. Pope John Paul II proclaims that not even a murderer loses his personal dignity, as God himself guarantees this. In making this statement, St. Pope John Paul II reminds us of our call to the foundational theme of Catholic social teaching, the life and dignity of the human person, and that we are to uphold human dignity, which does not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty. In keeping with this teaching, Pope Francis in 2018 approved a revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church as follows. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the human person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. More effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time does not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. So consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible. No matter how heinous the crime, if society can protect itself without ending a human life, it should do so. While the Old Testament includes some passages about taking the life of one who kills, the Old Testament and the teaching of Christ in the New Testament calls us to protect life, practice mercy, and reject vengeance. The death penalty is also riddled with practical failings. For example, Louisiana leads the nation per capita in wrongful death sentences. Therefore, the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops unequivocally supports Senator Jackson's bill to end the use of the death penalty. And finally, the Louisiana Conference of Catholic Bishops ask all women and men of good faith, especially those members of the legislature, to search their heart in an effort to seek mercy and love and to support the repeal of the death penalty and affirm the culture of life. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Sister, would you like to go first?
Pardon?
Would you like to begin?
Sure. In 1984, it was the first time I ever was with a human being who was executed. It was Pat Saunier. It had been an unspeakable crime in cold blood. He and his brother had killed 2 teenage kids.
Sister, go ahead and introduce yourself, too.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Sister Helen Prejean, and I've been working to educate the public and to work to end the death penalty in this country. Wrote the book Dead Man Walking to bring people through the whole journey, which is outrage at a crime, suffering of a family, and then bringing them through the execution, the whole journey. Blessedly, God had something to do with this. I think a great movie was made that takes people in the same journey, Dead Man Walking. And there's also an opera that takes people into the journey. And it is a journey for us, because outrage at a crime and the suffering of a family, and then often you do hear the argument, well, what would you do if you were that family? And don't you think that family has a right to have that punishment for that person? That's justice for that family. That's the argument. And so I descended into the whole thing, not knowing anything about criminal justice. I'm a Catholic nun. I was in a parish and I had prayer groups and Bible study and I taught kids. But I learned through this journey with this one man and then with the victim's family. So actually, the journey of the Catholic Church, where we, for a long time, from the 5th century, the Catholic Church taught that the state had the right to take life. And that was through many years where you didn't have prisons, you didn't have a way to protect society. So you had St. Augustine, you had St. Thomas Aquinas, just saying to protect society, for the defense of society, we will allow the state to take life. And that arrival in 2018, where you had Pope Francis finally codify it in the Catechism, comes through a lot of experience of what happens when you give the state the right to take life. Where we live in a time where we have a way to protect society. And we don't have to imitate the worst possible behavior. They killed and we're going to kill them. And even then to say, and we're going to do it for the victim's family. My experience with victims' families, not just here in Louisiana, but across this country, often the death penalty splits a family right in two. Some are for death, some aren't. So how do you have healing and deal with your grief and trauma? And then the other thing is, I witnessed in New Jersey when it was before their legislative committee about the death penalty, 62 murder victims' families testified the death penalty re-victimizes us because we wait and wait and wait for this justice you've promised us that never happens. The average wait from a person being sentenced in Louisiana to execution is 17 and a half years. This promise given to victims' families that this is what we're going to do for you, can it ever really heal them? Or what does it do for them? One woman said, I was giving a talk in Cincinnati, and she said, my mother was murdered. They gave the death penalty. Our family doesn't have a private place to go to heal. It's a public act. The media is at our door every time there's a change in the status of the case. How can we heal? We don't have a private place to go. It's a public thing. And so when the church finally arrived, and it was what Senator Jackson was saying, we as human beings cannot handle this thing. Even to say we're going to reserve it for the most heinous or the worst of the worst. How are you going to separate out what you call ordinary murders and only the heinous crimes, the worst of the worst? We're failing at it. It's broken. We're not able to make the bloody thing work. And the reason I think that we're not executing people anymore in Louisiana in practice, juries aren't going for it. Prosecutors aren't seeking it very much. In fact, you can find pockets in this country where you have prosecutors all for the death penalty, cutting notches on their belt, side by side with most of the counties where prosecutors aren't going for it anymore. Why? And it's this whole thing of, we don't give life. Who are we to take it and to take on ourselves that we were going to set up a system in which we were only going to be able to get the worst of the worst, and we're going to do it for victims' families. It's going to be good for everybody. And we have made more mistakes in this state. 11 exonerations out of and 28 people that we killed in this country, in this state. To what purpose? And you know the feeling I have, because I've been doing this a long time, I think I've been through 5 wardens at Angola. One warden told me, sister, you know who makes the best trustees in general in this prison? What crime they came for? Murder. He said most of the people here, when they got up that morning, they didn't know they were going to murder anybody. And then they come to prison. They learn to read. They can change. And that's another point that Pope Francis made. Who are we to say to a human being, you are finished, you are never going to change, and we're going to send you into eternity. And we have the authority to do that, and we're going to get a system, and we're going to get it right. And you look at who is in prison and who is on death row. We were talking about the kids earlier. about helping kids to change that have been traumatized. 90% of the people on death row, and you look at mental illness, you look at people traumatized, and then they do a violent act. But the death penalty is about us as a society. How do we respond? And I have accompanied 6 people to execution and witnessed that killing of human beings. And I told the story in Dead Man Walking. Do you ever think what happens to the people that carry out the killing for us? And I told the story of Fenton Cootie, who had been a supervisor on death row, and he called me in his office. He'd been through 5 executions. He comes home afterwards, and he said, I just get my lazy boy chair. My wife knows not to talk to me. In my gut, I know that act, when you render a human being defenseless and step by step kill them, that you're participating in something that is morally wrong. Even in prisoners of war taken, it's against human law, human rights, to tie their hands behind their backs and shoot them. But that is what we do to prisoners when we kill them. So I think if you look at it, there's a national trend that states aren't practicing the death penalty, and we're doing away with it. We don't need the death penalty to be safe. And we want to be a life state. We're made to be a life state. And as long as we have this thing of, oh, we want to reserve this thing for death, much less claiming we're doing it for the victim's family. Any victim's family in grief and in trauma is going to say, yeah, I want to kill them. But it's about us. It's about us making the decision we're going to do this as a state. So I urge you to pass this bill. We're ready for this bill.
Thank you for your testimony. Yes, sir. Sure. Would you like to go while he gets some water?
I think he wanted to go next, so I'll defer to him.
Okay.
For a second. Yeah, it's something very important.
Good morning, senators and others who are here to hear testimony regarding Senate Bill 294, introduced by Senator Katrina Jackson from Monroe. My name is Brett Malone, and I live in Shreveport. I was a graduate of East Texas Baptist University before going to graduate school in psychology and then postgraduate work at LSU in social work. My career has been in the field of human services as well as public health. However, I come to you today as the eldest son of Mary Ann Shaver Malone, who was abducted from her home and subsequently murdered on December 18th, 2000. Our mother had just recently welcomed her second grandson into the world and was preparing food that night for the Christmas holidays that we gathered for routinely. Our families and our entire community's lives were forever marred by the tragic events of that night. It had been 16 years since any kind of murder had happened in Plain Dealing, the tiny little town that I grew up in. Terror and intense grief and trauma were our individual and collective reactions to that event. And the security system companies made lots of money after that. On a very personal note, my own trauma was intensified that night when a local law enforcement officer, unknown to me then or since, leaned in close to me and stated, quote, "Just say the word and he'll never make it to trial." I was beyond shocked and immediately said, no more violence. That brief conversation resulted in my collapsing in the yard and vomiting until nothing was left in my body to expel. I never spoke about that to others until I sought therapy about 1.5 years after that. A few days after my mother's death, our family members were brought together by the DA and the sheriff to discuss the case that they were preparing to prosecute. We were all still in shock, as you can imagine, numb, quiet, very unsure about how things would unfold. Instead of any kind of grief counseling or talk of any options, we got from the DA, quote, "We're going for the death penalty on this one. Y'all don't have a problem with that, do you?" When I heard that, my body went cold. I was frozen and unable to speak at all. From what I recall, we all remained silent. Didn't really feel like we had an opportunity to object, even though, ironically, I recall my mother herself being against the death penalty, as was her mother. It's taken me 21 plus years to find my voice to speak on this publicly, and today I do say very clearly, yes, I have a problem with that. The traumas of that horrible night were not mine alone. Every member of my family and extended family has experienced prolonged grief and has struggled with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and addiction issues. All trauma related, for sure. The members of our small community also experience collective trauma, and with it, a great deal of fear. And sadly, the family members of the young man convicted of this crime felt the pain, the trauma, was shunned, were blamed, were treated very badly. At my mother's funeral, I delivered the eulogy. I can still recall the tensions that I felt in that moment. The church was packed. There were people standing around. They were out the door. It really affected the whole community. But there was a bloodlust that had infected our community. This desire and talks of killing him, of torturing him, of being violent. One of the statements that I made in the eulogy was from the Bible, a passage about not taking the law into our own hands and seeking justice rather than vengeance. The 21 years that have passed have been full of challenges to overcome. This time has also allowed me, and hopefully others, to make peace within, and if possible, with the man who's currently on death row. The young man who was convicted of a murder and sentenced to death was only 19 at the time. He's now spent more time on death row than he spent living before that night. I've not yet spoken with him or met him in person, but I've been trying to for about 4 years now. What I've learned in the past 2 decades is that my healing and my family's healing and our community's healing are all related to grace, mercy, and forgiveness. When I say forgiveness, this doesn't mean that my family or I want to set him free back into the world. It does, however, mean that this execution would likely inflict more trauma to us all. And most everyone close to me and my family and beyond have had to acknowledge that they would be okay with him living a long life in prison, that they're okay with that. For me, this would be justice. I don't see state executions as justice. Rather, they're a form of vengeance. The state of Louisiana will, if our policies and practices are not changed, execute another human being, and in my name, and in my family's name. And I'm here today to express very clearly that I strongly oppose anyone being killed in my name. We want justice, not vengeance, and we must end the cycle of violence. Part of the healing process for me has been learning about what justice is and is not, and learning that there are examples of justice that do not include a blood sacrifice of the person who is convicted of the crime. Restorative or reparative justice is something that was never discussed with us 21 years ago by the DA or the sheriff of our parish. I didn't even know what that was until about 4 years ago when I happened upon the Victim Offender Dialogue program here in Louisiana. This program is victim initiated and has the goal of preparing the victim and the offender for an eventual face-to-face meeting and conversation. Through this process, we have an opportunity for healing to occur. And it's a long process. Unfortunately, the Victim Offender Dialogue program in our state is grossly underfunded, understaffed, and unknown to most. I also learned that my VOD case was the first in Louisiana involving someone on death row. I really hope it's not the last, though. It's almost impossible not to spend a lot of time contemplating issues about justice, vengeance, and sanctity of life when one experiences a violent crime such as murder of one's family member. The healing process takes a very long time, a lot of soul work, and a lot of reflection. There's not been a day since my mother's death that I've not thought of her, all the what ifs, whys, and hows of that horrible night, but also how to move forward and to transform what was once grief, pain, and terror, and even anger and rage, into something good. How to make peace. One thing I do know for certain is this, that the execution of the man who was convicted of my mother's murder will not bring me any peace. It will not bring any of us joy. It will not erase the pain or restore my own faith in the justice system. Violence is cyclical, and for it to end, we must stop seeking violent means and pretend that it's justice. It's not. State executions are a form of vengeance, not justice. During the years of after my mother's murder, I've learned a lot from people who say that they are pro-life and that all lives matter. SB 294 is one opportunity for our state to actually prove that all lives truly matter and that we really do believe in the sanctity of life, even if it's the lives of those currently on death row. The people on death row are, in fact, just as human as you are and just as human as I am. That's something I think that we forget or never realize. Even though they have forfeited their freedom for the remainder of their life, however long or short that may be, they still are deserving of that life and are deserving of opportunities for redemption and of grace and mercy. I wrote this testimony just a couple of days ago on Easter Sunday. The irony of all of this is that we were observing the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the founder of the Christian faith. Let us not forget that it was the governing people of that time who sentenced him to death and then executed him. Welcome back, Senator White.
Glad to be back.
For those of you in the Senate who also profess to be Christian and pro-life, now's your opportunity to prove it and to end the state's practice of vengeance and adopt a better way of working towards peace, healing, and better understanding. There are many verses from the Bible that I could share today, but I'm going to just limit it to a few. For example, as you've done unto the least of these, you've done unto me. Love your enemies as yourself. Those without sin, cast the first stone. And Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. Other religious and moral institutions and traditions share these tenets and teachings. So we are dealing with universal concepts of justice. And when you think about it, who would Jesus execute? We've heard or will hear from others today who can speak to the issues related to the state's death penalty, from a cost analysis to racial injustice issues to the death penalty not being a deterrent to crime, and more. But if we are to seek justice, we must stop seeking vengeance. We often hear that people who kill others are monsters. It's a term that we use to distance ourselves from the other person. It's also a very dehumanizing term, because we don't want to think about the other person as being a fellow human being. We must recognize the humanity in all individuals in order for healing to happen and for justice to occur. I'll leave you with this before answering any questions you may have for us. It's a quote from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche from his writings on Beyond Good and Evil. Quote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you stare long enough into an abyss, the abyss will stare into you. I ask and pray that you seek a path that leads to peace and healing, because vengeance is not justice. Please prove to us all that lives truly matter. All lives."
Thank you, Mr. Malone, for your testimony. I'm sorry about the story with your mother, but we appreciate you coming and sharing that with us.